Transformers Exodus, Chapter 1. The Hall of Records in Iacon was closed to the public. In the archive stacks, at a workstation where he had been installed following the tradition and practice of his caste, sat a monitor named Orion Pax. He was tapped into the communication grid that invisibly spanned all of Cybertron, monitoring and recording every communication that passed through the grid. Those that met certain criteria he listened to, annotated, categorized, and saved in a different sector of the datanet. Like much of the rest of the great city of Iacon, the hall was constructed of a golden-hued alloy that lent itself to the curving architectural style that predominated elsewhere in the city. The architects of Iacon had favored towering, monumental buildings, topped by conical structures that looked as if they might take off. The entire city was a monument to aspirations. Only there were no aspirations among Cybertronians anymore. They were born into a caste, a place that they would maintain for their entire lives. The civilization of Cybertron existed in a perfect stasis. It had been that way for millennia. Iacon was in some ways a memorial of Cybertronian culture that had not existed in the memory banks of any existing Cybertronian. Inside the Hall of Records, another kind of stasis existed, the history of Cybertron, from the mythical ages of battles among the 13 primes across the billions of cycles to the latest transmissions on the latest bands. Orion Pax was charged with monitoring. All of it was here. All of it was categorized, cataloged, stored, indexed, and cross-indexed. After that, save for when the High Council or another authority got interested in a threat to civic order, the ever-growing collections in the Hall of Records were ignored. Once, or so Orion Pax understood from reading in the older records, Cybertronian civilization had maintained links with other planets that surrounded other stars. Via a network of space bridges constructed with technology long abandoned, populations of Cybertronians on far-flung planets had stayed in contact with Cybertron. Gigantion, Velocitron, even the Hub, all were once part of a greater Cybertronian culture. Now, the space bridges were all long since collapsed and degraded. The last of them, which hung in the skies between the 2 moons and the asteroid belt, had not been used since a long, long time ago. Even Orion Pax, who could ordinarily dig anything out of the records of Teletran 1 and the datanet, was not sure exactly how long it had been. Now, a Cybertronian like Orion Pax would not go to the stars. He would not fight nobly for the great ideals of the primes. A Cybertronian like Orion Pax would monitor, assess, and catalog transmissions on the grid, because that is what Cybertronians of his caste did. Other castes built and engineered, governed, made laws, or fought in the gladiatorial pits. From there, oddly enough, came some of the more interesting transmissions Orion Pax had heard lately. He was not a great follower of the arena, but even he knew of the most recent champion Megatronus. Quite a bold action to assume that name. It was not just any bot who could carry the weight of one of the 13 primes, whose deeds still echoed across the megacycles of history. This Megatronus had not lost a match since the early days of his career in the arena. The gladiators began with no names, and most of them ended that way as well. Megatronus had not just claimed a name, but a name that could not help but capture the attention of even those castes who pretended to pay no attention to such degraded entertainments as gladiatorial combat. The sight of two or more cybertronians tearing each other apart was something that few would admit enjoying. Yet the pits in the lower levels of 𝕉𝕠 were one of Cybertron's most popular tourist destinations, and the grid was alive with broadcasts and rebroadcasts of the various tournaments that were constantly going on. The only industry in 𝕉𝕠 that could rival gladiatorial entertainment was recovery and reconstruction. The mecha surgical engineers of that city and its gladiatorial rival Slaughter City were without peer. Arena combat was illegal across Cybertron, but the High Council in its wisdom understood that a population confined by caste needed certain outlets. So the pits in 𝕉𝕠, which had begun long ago as a diversion for the workers in the great foundries there, were now entrenched, even if technically outside the law of Cybertron. In Slaughter City, it was much the same. So it was odd that from 𝕉𝕠 and Slaughter City, Orion Pax should be hearing and seeing arguments he could only call philosophical. And they were coming from the greatest of the illicit champions of 𝕉𝕠's pits, this Megatronus. The transmissions were fragmentary and distorted, originating as they did from deep inside the metallic bowels of 𝕉𝕠. Between those lower levels and the grid receptors, they picked up enormous interference from the industrial processes that drove 𝕉𝕠, and Orion Pax knew the civilization of Cybertron. Nothing could be created without the raw materials first being refined. That happened in 𝕉𝕠 and the Badlands that stretched between it and the Hydrax Plateau. As long as those Badlands fueled the needs of Cybertron, the High Council would keep turning a blind optic to the gladiator pits. Orion Pax wondered how long that would continue. He listened to the most recent of Megatronus's transmissions, fingers hovering over the interface that would determine where he cataloged it. Are Cybertronians not made of the same materials? My alloys are the same as those in the frame of a High Counselor. My lubricants are the same as those that lubricated the joints of the 13 themselves. Megatronus's voice scraped and rasped like one of the great machines in the factories of 𝕉𝕠. Orion Pax looked up and down the row of other Cybertronians of the same caste as he. All of them would spend their careers monitoring and cataloging, feeding the vast databases of Iacon. This was the way that civilization of Cybertron had been since long before the creation of Orion Pax. And yet, they were made of the same materials as the archivist Alpha Trion, or any member of the High Council. Would a counselor spend his life monitoring transmissions? We are individuals! Once we were free! Megatronus's voice scraped through Orion Pax's head. What would his fellow monitors think if they could hear? They would report this Megatronus in a nanoclick. That's what they would do, Orion Pax thought. As if in reply, Megatronus said, The High Council, if they heard me now, would quietly render me into slag. Do not doubt it. They may be listening now. If I vanish, carry on my work. Soundwave, you and Shockwave will carry on. You are my trusted lieutenants. A second voice came in. Lieutenants? Are you now the general of an army, Megatronus? Orion Pax listened harder. He ran a check on the new voice. It was neither Shockwave nor Soundwave. He had heard them before, and had records and database entries for each. But this new voice was not in the index he maintained to keep track of Megatronus's associates. Who was it? It was not part of Orion Pax's job to investigate. He monitored, observed, recorded. Investigators were of another caste. He could, however, report to ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠, the overseer. Orion Pax sampled the new voice and spent a few cycles compiling a report. It wouldn't do to present himself to ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 without a good reason, and proof of how good the reason was. The archivist of Iacon, ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠, was far older than Orion Pax, who had heard stories that he had existed since the great age of the space bridge-fueled expansion, the high point of Cybertronian civilization. What that must have been like, to be able to ride the dimensional bridges to other stars. Orion Pax, ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 said. What brings you here to interrupt my work? I seek advice. Orion activated the recording of Megatronus. ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 put down the antiquated stylus he used to make entries in the single book that sat on his desk. The archivist of Iacon had databases and endless hard copy records of virtually everything that had ever happened in the history of Cybertron. Yet he chose stylus and book as his interface. Like many of the older Cybertronians Orion Pax knew, ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 had grown eccentric. When the recording had played out of a wall-mounted speaker, and ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 had taken his standard moment to tap his style on the desk and think over various potential responses, the archivist said, "Megatronus." "Why has he named himself after a mythical being?" Orion Pax asked. "If the stories are true, Megatronus believed until the end that he would be vindicated," ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 said. "He believed himself to be doing what was right, even if his methods destroyed much of what he professed to believe. Not much of an example if you're plotting a revolution," Orion Pax said. With a dry chuckle, ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 stood. "Indeed not. But perhaps that is not the only example to be taken from the deeds of Megatronus. Who is this upstart?" "He has been a gladiator in ℍ𝕒𝕠. Like all of them, he began without a name, a worker who took to the arena as a way to glory. He has never lost, and his fame has grown to the point that few other gladiators will fight him one-on-one. Now it seems that he is no longer content to be the greatest gladiator in ℍ𝕒𝕠. He has grander ambitions." "Ambition," ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 echoed. "That is not a quality encouraged on Cybertron, as you know." He fell silent, and Orion Pax thought he detected something of a wistful tone in the archivist's voice. He waited, and after several cycles, ℕ𝕒𝕠𝕠 spoke again. "Go back to your post, Orion Pax. Continue to listen. When you know what this Megatronus is planning, return to me, and we will consult further."